Lifelong career prosecutor Jack Smith, who prior to investigating Donald Trump, brought cases against Democrats and Republicans, calmly and dispassionately answered questions from lawmakers that ranged from the inquisitive to the ludicrous. Today's testimony amounts to the most thorough accounting of the criminal cases against Donald Trump for his efforts to overturn an election and end the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power in the United States of America.
The MAGA Republican hearing with special counsel Jack Smith completely detonated in Donald Trump's face, and there's no other way to describe it. What was supposed to be a political ambush turned into a public disaster for Trump and the MAGA wing of Congress. We covered the entire hearing live, start to finish, and now that the dust has settled, it's clear that this was one of those moments where the strategy backfired so badly it actually strengthened the very case they were trying to undermine.
Here at the White House, President Donald Trump believes former special counsel Jack Smith should be prosecuted for leading two different federal investigations against him. But during this hearing that took place on Capitol Hill that grew heated at times, Smith stood by his decision to charge President Trump.
So let's walk through what actually happened, because if you didn't sit through the whole hearing, you might miss just how damaging this was. From the very beginning, Jack Smith made it clear that he wasn't there to play games, and he certainly wasn't intimidated. He opened by explaining why he brought the charges he did against Donald Trump, and he didn't hedge his words.
Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in criminal activity. If asked whether to prosecute a former president based on the same facts today, I would do so regardless of whether that president was a Democrat or a Republican.
He said that the decision was based on evidence, on law, and on duty. Crimes were committed, and his job was to prosecute them. That opening statement alone set the tone. MAGA Republicans were clearly hoping to rattle him, to get him defensive, to make him sound political or uncertain. Instead, he came across as calm, deliberate, and unwavering. He wasn't there to relitigate cable news talking points. He was there to explain, on the record, that the charges against Trump weren't theoretical, weren't partisan, and weren't optional. They were the result of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
We did our work pursuant to department policy. We followed the facts and we followed the law, and that process resulted in proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed serious crimes. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen because he's threatening me.
Now, one of the most telling parts of the hearing was what Jack Smith wasn't allowed to talk about. MAGA Republicans repeatedly tried to bait him into discussing the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, where Trump concealed and obstructed the return of highly sensitive national security material. But because Judge Eileen Cannon has refused to unseal key records, the Department of Justice warned that Smith could not go beyond very narrow procedural descriptions without risking sanctions. In other words, the court system itself was preventing a full public discussion of one of Trump's most serious cases. Even with those constraints, Smith made something very clear.
I will not be intimidated. I think these statements are also made as a warning to others what will happen if they stand up. And I am, as I say, I'm not going to be intimidated. We did our work.
He said plainly that he would not be intimidated by Trump, by threats, or by political pressure. He stated that his integrity was not up for negotiation and that no amount of personal attacks or intimidation would cause him to back down. That statement mattered because by that point in the hearing, it was already obvious that Trump and his allies were trying to send a message. Go after Trump, and we will come after you. Smith addressed that directly when questioned about Trump's public attacks. Trump has repeatedly called him a disgrace, a criminal, hundreds of times.
On social media, President Trump called Smith deranged and said, quote, hopefully the Attorney General is looking at what he's done.
Smith didn't flinch. He said those statements were meant to intimidate him and to serve as a warning to others who might stand up to Trump. But he also said something far more chilling, that he fully expects Trump's Justice Department, if given the chance, to try to indict him personally because Trump has ordered it.
And Mr. Smith, do you believe that President Trump's Department of Justice will find some way to indict you?
I believe that they will do everything in their power to do that because they've been ordered to by the president.
That admission landed like a thunderclap in the room. From there, the hearing only got more intense. Smith spoke about Trump's decision to pardon or grant clemency to January 6th insurrectionists, stating that it was entirely reasonable to believe that many of these individuals would commit further crimes. In his view, these were not misunderstood patriots or harmless protesters. They were people who had already demonstrated a willingness to engage in violence and lawlessness, and subsequent events had proven those concerns justified.
The people who assaulted police officers and were convicted after trial, in my view, and I think in the view of the judges who sentenced them to prison, are dangers to their community. As you've mentioned, some of these people have already committed crimes against their communities again, and I think all of us, if we're reasonable, know that there's going to be more crimes committed by these people in the future.
That's when Democratic members began methodically dismantling the MAGA narrative around January 6th. Congressman Jared Moskowitz took the floor and did something devastatingly effective. He read into the record the actual statements made by MAGA Republicans immediately after January 6th, statements they now pretend never existed. He quoted figures like Jim Jordan, Ted Cruz, Chip Roy, Steve Scalise, Lindsey Graham, and Kevin McCarthy, all of whom, at the time, condemned the violence, praised Capitol Police, and acknowledged Trump's responsibility. The effect was brutal. Moskowitz wasn't arguing. He wasn't editorializing. He was simply holding up a mirror. These were their own words, spoken before the political rewrite, before the whitewashing, before January 6th was rebranded as a peaceful tourist visit. The hypocrisy was undeniable, and it rattled the MAGA side of the room. Moskowitz followed that by pointing out something even more uncomfortable. MAGA Republicans claim to hate living in the past, yet they obsess endlessly over January 6th, Hunter Biden, Hillary Clinton's emails, Barack Obama, and COVID. He mocked their fixation, saying they love the past so much they're still reenacting the Civil War. The line wasn't just funny. It cut straight to the heart of the MAGA grievance politics that fuels these hearings in the first place. Then came one of the ugliest moments of the day. MAGA Republican Troy Niels went after the January 6th police officers themselves, many of whom were sitting in the room. He blamed Capitol leadership and intelligence failures, explicitly absolving Trump. As he spoke, Officer Michael Fanone could be seen reacting with visible fury, eventually mouthing an unmistakable "Go F yourself." It was raw, unscripted, and completely understandable. These were officers who had been beaten, assaulted, and traumatized, now being blamed by the very people who once praised them. From there, Democrats continued to tighten the vise. Members entered prior statements from MAGA Republicans into the record, forcing them to confront their own contradictions. Others questioned Smith about intimidation, about threats, and about the chilling effect Trump's rhetoric has on the justice system. Smith made clear that his office followed Department of Justice policy, followed the facts, followed the law, and reached its conclusions independently, without pressure from President Biden, Vice President Harris, or Attorney General Merrick Garland. And that independence matters because MAGA Republicans tried desperately to suggest that Smith was acting as a political hitman. But every attempt collapsed under scrutiny. When Congressman Dan Goldman explained the use of phone toll records, he calmly dismantled the claim that Smith had spied on lawmakers. Toll records don't capture content. They don't capture messages. They simply show who contacted whom and when during a narrow window while a conspiracy to overturn the election was unfolding. That's standard investigative practice, not surveillance. By the time the first half of the hearing wrapped, the picture was clear. MAGA Republicans hadn't exposed corruption. They hadn't undermined the prosecution. Instead, they put Trump's legal peril on full display, reinforced the seriousness of the charges, and reminded the public yet again what January 6th actually was. And this was only the beginning. As the hearing moved forward, the MAGA strategy unraveled even faster, because instead of landing blows on Jack Smith, they exposed just how hollow their talking points really are. What became obvious very quickly is that this hearing was never about oversight or facts. It was about intimidation, distraction, and rewriting history. And none of that worked. One of the most revealing moments came when Jack Smith was asked directly about the personal attacks Donald Trump has been hurling at him nonstop. Trump has called him a disgrace to humanity, a criminal, a radical left Marxist, and has used the phrase deranged Jack Smith over and over again on social media. Smith didn't dodge the question. He said plainly that those statements were meant to intimidate him and his staff, and more importantly, to send a warning to anyone else who might dare to hold Trump accountable. He made it clear that this is part of Trump's playbook. Attack loudly, stir resentment, and then hope someone else takes the hint and does the dirty work. When asked whether he believed Trump's Department of Justice would try to indict him personally if given the chance, Smith didn't hesitate. He said he believed they would do everything in their power to do so because Trump has ordered it. That admission landed hard. It wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a former federal prosecutor saying under oath that he expects retaliation from a sitting president simply for doing his job. That's not normal. That's authoritarian behavior laid bare. Democratic members seized on that moment because it perfectly illustrated the stakes. This isn't just about Trump being angry. It's about a president who uses threats and public intimidation to try to bend the justice system to his will. Several Democrats pointed out that this is exactly how January 6th unfolded. Trump didn't explicitly order violence, but he inflamed his supporters, told them to fight like hell, and then watched as chaos erupted. Smith acknowledged that the pattern is unmistakable and that intimidation is not incidental to Trump's behavior, it's central to it. At that point, MAGA Republicans tried to pivot. Instead of grappling with January 6th or Trump's conduct, they attempted to accuse Smith of spying on lawmakers. Congressman Darrell Issa led that charge, repeatedly claiming that Smith's office secretly surveilled members of Congress. The accusation fell apart almost immediately. Smith calmly stated that his office did not spy on anyone and complied fully with Department of Justice rules and judicial oversight. That's when Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman stepped in and dismantled the claim piece by piece. Goldman, a former federal prosecutor, explained in clear, simple terms what toll records are and what they are not. Toll records show phone numbers, dates, and call durations. They do not show content. They do not record conversations. They do not capture text messages. They are a standard investigative tool used to understand communication patterns during a conspiracy. In this case, they were used to corroborate evidence that Trump had directed Rudy Giuliani to contact members of Congress in an effort to delay the certification of the election. There was no spying, no wiretapping, no secret surveillance, just basic investigative work. Watching that exchange, it became painfully clear that many MAGA Republicans either don't understand how federal investigations work or are intentionally misrepresenting them. Either way, the effect was the same. They looked unserious and unprepared, while Smith and the Democrats came across as grounded in facts and law. The hearing also returned again and again to the issue MAGA Republicans desperately wanted to avoid, January 6th itself. Congressman Jamie Raskin addressed one of the most common MAGA defenses head-on, the idea that Trump's conduct was protected by the First Amendment. Raskin asked Smith whether there is any valid First Amendment defense for defrauding the public, disrupting a federal proceeding, or violating voting rights. Smith's answer was unequivocal. The First Amendment does not protect speech that facilitates a crime. Fraud is carried out with words. Conspiracies are formed through communication. Speech used to commit criminal acts is not protected, and the Supreme Court has been crystal clear on that point. Raskin drove the point home with a stark example. The rioters who assaulted police officers on January 6th were chanting political slogans. That didn't make their violence protected speech. Saying, "Stop the steal," doesn't give someone a constitutional right to attack law enforcement or attempt to overthrow the government. The logic MAGA Republicans were pushing simply doesn't hold up under even minimal legal scrutiny. Then came one of the most emotionally charged moments of the hearing. Congressman Eric Swalwell addressed Jack Smith and the January 6th police officers directly. He told Smith that he had done everything right and that the officers had done everything right. He then turned his attention to his Republican colleagues and accused them of putting on a show for the cameras. Swalwell said something that clearly struck a nerve, that many of these same Republicans privately called Trump crooked, cruel, and a scumbag. But when the cameras turn on, they shrink and fall in line. That accusation hit because it rang true. Multiple Democrats echoed the sentiment that this hearing wasn't about truth. It was about performative loyalty. Swalwell pointed out that MAGA Republicans were lucky they weren't under oath, because if they were, they'd have to admit what they really think about Trump behind closed doors. Meanwhile, MAGA members continued to dodge substantive questions. They avoided discussing the actual evidence from January 6th. They avoided Trump's role. They avoided the seriousness of the charges. Instead, they tried to relitigate unrelated cases Smith had worked on in the past or attack witnesses like Cassidy Hutchinson. It was deflection piled on deflection. One particularly striking moment came when Congressman Ted Lieu pointed out how desperate Republicans were to avoid discussing the Epstein files. He argued that MAGA Republicans would rather spend hours attacking Jack Smith over the prosecution of Trump than confront Trump's documented associations with Jeffrey Epstein and the continued refusal by the Department of Justice to release the vast majority of Epstein-related files. Lieu demanded hearings on that issue, accusing Republicans of selectively caring about transparency only when it serves Trump. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. MAGA Republicans weren't interested in accountability. They were interested in protecting Trump at all costs. And in doing so, they repeatedly proved Jack Smith's core argument that Trump believes himself above the law and expects the system to bend to his will. As the hearing continued, Democratic members reinforced one key takeaway again and again. Smith was not pressured by President Biden. He was not directed by Attorney General Merrick Garland. He was given independence, followed the evidence, and made prosecutorial decisions based on the facts. Every attempt to paint him as a political operative collapsed under oath. What MAGA Republicans thought would be a spectacle designed to intimidate and discredit instead became a showcase of their own contradictions. They attacked law enforcement while claiming to support the police. They rewrote January 6th while their own past statements were read into the record. They accused Smith of misconduct while failing to produce any evidence to back it up. By the end of this phase of the hearing, one thing was crystal clear. The more MAGA Republicans talked, the worse it got for Donald Trump. The hearing didn't weaken the case against him. It reinforced it. And it made something else unmistakably obvious. This fight isn't just about Trump's past. It's about whether the rule of law still applies when a president decides it shouldn't. By the time the hearing wrapped up, whatever MAGA Republicans thought they were accomplishing had completely collapsed under its own weight. Instead of discrediting Jack Smith, they validated him. Instead of muddying the waters around January 6th, they clarified them. And instead of shielding Donald Trump, they exposed just how extreme, defensive, and detached from reality his defenders have become. One of the final takeaways that stood out was how little MAGA Republicans actually wanted to talk about the substance of January 6th. For all their bluster, they largely avoided the hard facts: the coordinated effort to overturn the election, the pressure campaign on state officials, the fake electors scheme, the attack on the Capitol, and the violent assault on police officers. When those topics came up, it was almost always Democrats who raised them, armed with evidence, quotes, and timelines. MAGA Republicans preferred distractions, old grievances, unrelated cases from Jack Smith's career, and attacks on witnesses like Cassidy Hutchinson. That avoidance said more than any speech could. What also became unmistakable is how deeply uncomfortable MAGA Republicans are with the record they themselves created. Hearing their own post-January 6th statements read back to them was devastating. These were not liberal interpretations or hostile media spin. These were their own words, spoken when the shock of the attack was still fresh and the political calculations hadn't yet hardened. They condemned the violence. They praised Capitol Police. They acknowledged Trump's responsibility. And now, years later, they are pretending none of that ever happened. The contrast was jarring, and it exposed the rewriting of history in real time. The treatment of the January 6 police officers was another moment that left a lasting impression. Watching MAGA members deflect blame onto Capitol leadership and intelligence failures, while officers who were beaten and traumatized sat in the room, was grotesque. The anger from those officers wasn't performative. It was the reaction of people who risked their lives and are now being scapegoated by politicians desperate to protect one man. That moment cut through the noise in a way no talking point ever could. Jack Smith, meanwhile, never lost his footing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't editorialize. He didn't lash out. He simply answered questions, explained the law, and stood by his decisions. When pressed about intimidation, he didn't dramatize it. He acknowledged it and moved on. When accused of misconduct, he explained procedures. When challenged on First Amendment defenses, he cited settled law. That contrast between methodical professionalism and frantic political theater was impossible to miss. Democrats used their time strategically. They weren't there to score viral moments for the sake of it. They were building a record. They were reminding the public what January 6th actually was. They were establishing, again and again, that speech used to facilitate a crime is not protected, that intimidation of prosecutors is dangerous, and that no president is above the law. And they did it in a way that MAGA Republicans could not effectively counter. What made this hearing especially damaging for Trump is that it reinforced the central premise of the prosecution without ever turning into a trial preview. Smith didn't need to reveal new evidence. He didn't need to argue guilt. All he had to do was explain why the law applies equally, why evidence matters, and why threats don't change facts. The more MAGA Republicans attacked him, the more credible he became to anyone watching in good faith. There was also a broader political implication hanging over the entire hearing. Smith's acknowledgement that he expects retaliation from a Trump-controlled Justice Department wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the rule of law. It was a warning about what happens when a president treats prosecution as vengeance and loyalty as immunity. That moment reframed the stakes of the entire hearing. This wasn't just about past crimes. It was about whether accountability itself can survive. By the end, it was hard to escape one conclusion. This hearing hurt Trump far more than it helped him. It reminded the public of January 6th. It highlighted the seriousness of the charges. It exposed the hypocrisy and cowardice of many of his defenders. And it showed that despite relentless attacks, the legal case against him is grounded, coherent, and unshaken. MAGA Republicans wanted a spectacle. They wanted intimidation. They wanted chaos. What they got instead was clarity. They put Jack Smith on a national stage, and he used it to calmly reaffirm that no amount of shouting, threats, or historical revisionism changes the reality of what happened. For Donald Trump, that's a nightmare scenario, because the more this case is discussed in plain terms, the harder it becomes to spin, dismiss, or intimidate away. In the end, this hearing wasn't a turning point in the way MAGA hoped. It was a reminder of January 6th, a reminder of the evidence, a reminder of the law, and a reminder that despite all the noise, the reckoning Trump has been trying to outrun is still very much alive.